Hello, souls and demons, and welcome back to the show. Today's story was written by Varanus Priscus, a story about an expedition to Venezuela that has gone terribly, terribly wrong. And before we get started, if you've been enjoying your stay so far, a review on this podcast or a thumbs up goes an incredibly long way for the future of the stories being told here. And with that, let's sit back, grip our seats, and enjoy the show. History is full of explorers, people who were the first to set foot on a new frontier, discovering whole new worlds previously unknown to us. Most notably Charles Darwin, who stumbled upon the Galapagos Islands, developing the theory of natural selection as a result. Roald Amundsen, the first man to reach the South Pole, and Jacques Cousteau, who explored the depths of the oceans. Because of this desire to know the unknown, we've been driven to undertake long, perilous excursions throughout history, and as a result, there are no more blank spots on the map. On the contrary, however, many of these places we've discovered still hold much which we've yet to find. When you ask someone what there is left to explore and, apart from the vast cosmos about which we know virtually nothing, the most frequent answer will be the ocean depths. While this is certainly true in many aspects, there are still countless other places where, unknowingly, we've hardly scratched the surface. Realistically, I knew it wouldn't happen, but for a time, I'd always hoped to find something equally as remarkable as many of these early scientists and explorers. It was my assumption that if I were to ever just come across something new and exciting to us, it would be in either the ocean's depths or in one of the world's vastly inaccessible rainforests. Soon, however, I would be finding out that it would be the latter of which I mentioned, in a way, at least. For years, I was a part of a group of scientists, ecologists and biologists, who were doing research in the rainforests and grasslands of South America's Guiana Shield. I, specifically, a herpetologist, was tasked with monitoring populations of reptiles and amphibians. Most of my work was assessing the impacts of habitat fragmentation and climate change on populations of tropical frogs and toads. My most recent excursion, however, would put me onto unfamiliar ground, on formations known as the Tepui. The Tepui are tabletop mountains, or mesas found in the Guiana highlands of South America, most notably in Venezuela and the western part of Guyana. The word Tepui means house of the gods, in the native tongue of the Piman, the indigenous people who inhabit the region. Many are found as isolated entities rather than in connected ranges, which makes them the host of a unique array of endemic plant and animal species. Such isolation has led to the presence of endemic flora and fauna through evolution over millions of years in a remote ecosystem of animals and plants, cut off from the rest of the world by the imposing rock walls. The mountains' isolation has been able to capture the attention of explorers and scientists alike over the past century, with many explorers believing the endemics of Tepui represent relict fauna and flora, which underwent speciation when the plateau became fragmented over geological time. This sort of outlandish hypothesis of remote wildlife representing remnants of ancient species was an inspiration to various forms of fiction in popular culture, such as the work of famous 19th century author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. In reality, however, much of the fauna wasn't dinosaurs or prehistoric mammals as depicted in such literature, but rather a plethora of invertebrates and, of course, amphibians. which was what I was there to set my focus on. The mountain my research expedition would send me atop of was known as Ayan, located within Canaima National Park. It was here where I would be doing a survey of the Tepui's endemic amphibian populations. Upon arrival, my expedition was stationed at a base within Canaima, where me and the 2 other scientists would begin preparing for our excursion onto the summit. The view of the mountain towered above the surrounding jungles and savannas, complemented by the view of Angel Falls, the world's tallest waterfall. As the sun began to set that evening, I stood there, just staring at Ayan and Angel Falls. Andrea, one of my colleagues, noticed me just standing there. "Mesmerizing, isn't it?" she said. Yeah," I replied. "Crazy to think how life thrives here, isn't it?" I gave no reply and continued gazing out into the mountain view. As I stood there, the color of the sky slowly began to dim, creating a reddish-orange backdrop against the foreground of the towering rock. The next morning, we prepared our gear and left base via helicopter. As my colleagues and I took off into the air, the craft began to rise over the view of water plummeting down from the falls. Looking at it from the air was even more breathtaking than from ground level, with the mist from the falls slightly fogging up the glass. The higher we ascended, the deeper the view of the water descending onto the ground appeared, as if it were falling from heaven. Finally, the chopper flew over the mountain edge and onto a flat tabletop plain of bushland and rocky outcropping. The chopper lowered into a safe spot for landing, the sound of propellers beginning to slowly fade as we touched the ground. The 3 of us exited the craft and, after setting up a temporary base of operations, began to designate transects for our field surveys. By using these transects, it would allow us to understand the population density of amphibian species per square unit. The survey I would perform took place on a sparsely foliaged sandstone flat, with a stream that ran throughout it. As I moved gradually through the first few plots of land, I cautiously observed my surroundings, searching for signs of anything that moved, only to turn up with nothing at first. But as I continued, it wasn't long before I heard a high-pitched broadcast of chirps coming from the stream. Cautiously, I walked towards the source of these sounds, and there it was. At the edge of the water, beneath a patch of vegetation, was Oreophrynella cryptica, a recently discovered species of bush toad, hardly ever documented by scientists. So much so that it has yet to be given a proper common name. This find was not only exciting, but was also enlightening news to know this species, which we know little about, still persists, despite the looming threat of climate change. After recording the species in my survey, I continued on. As I moved through the transects, I recorded several frogs, and even some lizard species native to the Tepui. Amphibians may be my objective here, but as a herpetologist, reptiles such as lizards and snakes are also a focus of study. The last plot on my survey brought me to the source of the stream, a small waterfall at the edge of an outcropping. Here I was certainly likely to find species of frogs. As I got closer to the waterfall from the side, I could feel the cold air from its mist, refreshing after a day in the hot sun. I began to hear chirping, squeakier in pitch from that of the toad, and as I looked, there were several frogs on a boulder side beneath the falls. This species, Anomaloglossus tepuiensis, was also yet to have been given a common name. I recorded these individuals for this plot, and decided to head back towards base, recording any more individual frogs or toads that I may encounter in the plots during my return. when I departed the area, something was different. The way from which I came was shrouded in a thick, ghostly fog that was settling in from the west. Fog at this elevation was normal in the Tepui, as the clouds surrounding the mountains often pass over close to the summit. But this fog seemed to just come out of thin air. I didn't seem to recall seeing it rolling in. Perhaps I was beneath the falls for longer than I felt I was. Regardless of its origin, I need to get back to base safely. I carefully but nervously traversed through the thick fog, heading back the way I came to the best of my memory. Barely able to see 3 feet in front of me and hoping that, in time, I would reach base. Soon, however, I began to realize that my surroundings, although hardly visible, were completely unfamiliar. I remembered enough that this wasn't the way I had come, and that I was indeed lost. I knew better than to panic, in spite of my heart racing. My best option was to stay put and wait for the fog to pass, whenever that would be. It didn't help that almost nothing was visible, not even the light from the setting sun. I sat down for a second onto the rocky limestone ground in order to collect myself mentally. I carefully inhaled and exhaled and told myself it's fine. Let it pass and you'll be back on track. I continued to mentally reassure myself, waiting for the surrounding mists to calmly pass over. I waited, calmly sitting and breathing for what seemed like an hour. But the fog looked in no way like it was fading. I held myself together, despite my nervous inner thoughts. I knew that this all had to pass eventually. While I was wading in and out, not only was it nearly impossible to see anything in front of me, everything in all directions was bizarrely quiet, aside from the faint sound of the wind. It didn't feel right. Seeing as before, I was able to hear the sound of the stream running, of birds in the distance, and of the amphibians I was counting. This, however, was just off-putting silence. It was soon broken by a faint echo off in the distance. The best way I could describe it was some sort of rhythmic clicking, the sound seemingly bouncing off of the rocky landscape of the Tepui summit. Despite not being able to see what exactly it was, I was able to deduce the direction it was coming from, and I wanted to see what it was. Logically, I knew better than to leave the spot I was waiting at, as I could be moving even farther from the trail back to base. Being my curious self, however, I couldn't help it, and I slowly headed towards the source of the noise. I knew in this fog, I had to proceed with the utmost caution, as one step could have had me over a ledge and seriously injured. This meant I had to carefully calculate each step I took. Proceeding closer on the horizon, I was able to make out 2 slender shapes in the distance. Both were stationary, looming in the distance across the flats. After about a minute, there was movement from one of them, a subtle head tilt. I inched forward several meters. The closer I got, the clearer they appeared to me. And soon enough, I was able to tell that these mysterious figures were birds. Several species of birds are known to inhabit the Tepui. Most of them are either small or ground-dwelling. I quietly moved nearer, until finally the fog around them cleared. And something wasn't right. I'm no ornithologist, but I know enough to know that no bird from the Tepui matches the description of whatever these were. If I was to describe it from memory, it had long, slender legs like a stork, but its head looked like some sort of hawk or eagle, with a slightly larger bill. The larger of the 2 flapped its wings, or what small appendages could even be called such. while throwing back its head and proceeding to make the rhythmic clicking I had just heard before. Up closer, it sounded more like the engine of a boat starting up. Not a call I expected from something the size of a border collie at most. What seemed to be happening between the two looked like some sort of courtship dance, as expected of most birds. Suddenly, the smaller one threw its head down, mouth ajar, and made some sort of hissing noise. It did this for a good 10 seconds, sounding like air escaping from a balloon. From its mouth ejected the half-digested remains of what looked like a tiny lizard, the larger animal lowering its head to pick it up and consume it for itself. There's no doubt that these birds match no known records of endemic avifauna. The idea of something remaining undetected within the ecosystems of the Tepui is not entirely impossible, as in certain instances particular species were found to be living on some of the summits. Although most of these species were that which we're familiar with, occurring where they were previously thought to be absent. These, however, they didn't seem to resemble any South American bird I've seen over the years. Did I just discover a new species? Then, an interesting thought crossed my mind. Something about these birds seemed familiar. Like I could have sworn I've seen them from somewhere before. Only I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. I stood there quietly, just looking at them, trying to figure out what it was about that I recognized. As I stood there, my attention shifted to one detail, the hook-like indent at the tip of their bill. It dawned on me immediately that I've seen a bird that looked just like this before, only as an illustration in a book. The only difference is that these were much smaller than the size of the bird I had read about. That wasn't all, however. Those things were supposed to be extinct, having died out around 2 to 4 million years ago. Then again, perhaps the resemblance was the result of coincidence, seeing how the phenomenon of a species evolving to resemble something unrelated was not all that uncommon in nature. Regardless of classification, one question was still persisting. Just how could previous expeditions have missed these? It just doesn't make sense, even in an ecosystem as isolated and remote as this. For several minutes, I continued to observe the pair as they courted each other, the two of them rhythmically clicking to one another. And then, it stopped. The two of them began to make quick darting movements with their head, left to right. Despite me being a couple of meters away, they didn't seem to mind my presence whatsoever, carrying on as if I was absent. Now, however, they seemed distressed. Without warning, the pair bolted away, disappearing into the seemingly perpetual fog. I just stood there, no clue as to why they just ran off. Before I could further investigate, this feeling overtook me, as if I was surrounded from each side by someone or something. But there was nothing around me, or at least it seemed that way at first. Out of primal fear and instinct, I scanned my surroundings, despite not being able to see a damn thing past a few measly feet. And I swear, for a quick second, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a person. Immediately, I knew that there was nothing else it could be besides one of my colleagues. Without further questions, I rushed over to it, expecting to see a familiar face. While doing so, however, the figure in the distance suddenly vanished. "No, wait!" I called out, but nothing awaited me. I was simply met with eerie silence in all directions. Nothing visible but the rocks and vegetation I could just hardly make out in front of me. I wanted to vent out my anger and frustration, being lost out here for who knows how long. with still no sign of a familiar face. But doing so wouldn't do jack to help the predicament I was in. The outline in the fog, though, if that was one of my team members, why didn't they approach me or even call out? I was surely within a reasonable distance for them to have heard me. It just didn't add up. I sat down once again, trying to keep myself calm. Just barely, I managed to keep my cool. Yet all I wanted was to see somebody, anybody again. As I sat there, I looked around, hoping to see the figure of whoever that was out in the distance again. Nothing. Just nothing but endless fog. Then I felt something on the boulder I was on top of. I looked and there were several wide crater-like indentations engraved into it. Some sort of erosion, perhaps. That's not all, but the center of each was colored with a dark, faintly reddish color, almost like dried blood. It was confusing and, bizarrely enough, mildly off-putting. Diverting my attention once more, another sound rang out, a sort of rumbling. Only this time, it started out faint, but slowly grew louder. It didn't take a physicist to figure out that something was headed this way. And whatever it was, I was about to find out. Out into the fog, I made out the shapes of several llama or alpaca-like animals, trotting past several meters away. Now I had no idea how to wrap my head around this. Mammals are incredibly rare on Tepui, with only rodents and possums making up the endemics. All other mammals recorded here seem to be occasional vagrants. Ungulates, hooved mammals, are not one of those. Such mammals just aren't capable of avoiding detection for this long, let alone making their way up here to establish a population. There's just no possible way previous scientists could have missed large mammals like these, living on a Tepui summit. Wanting to know more, I cautiously continued onto their trail into the fog. While I still proceeded carefully through the mists, there were tracks to follow, which made things somewhat easier. The path had brought me into a patch of shrubbery and sparse greenery, and up ahead, there they were. They seemed more timid than the birds from before, so I decided to observe from where I was without approaching. Looking at them more clearly, these things weren't llamas, but rather something else. They sported a large, bulging nose, similar to a moose, and their hooves weren't split, but had 3 visible digits, much like a rhinoceros or a tapir. Like the birds, they didn't pay much mind to my presence, although the way they moved indicated them being rather skittish. It was evident in their behavior too, with the animals in the center of the group feeding on the low browse, while the individuals farther away seemed to be gazing off into the distance, occasionally turning their heads side to side. One of them locked eyes with me for a minute, staring me down with horizontal pupils within their dark brown eyes. These were apparently lookouts, but for what? Vigilance in species is performed to decrease risk of predation, and if these individuals are sentries, as I've inferred, this would imply the existence of some sort of predator. Whatever carnivore that might be was beyond me. In an instant, one of the sentries turned their head sharply in the other direction, their ears pointed in the direction they were looking. They were clearly focused on something, whatever it was, not being visible on account of the fog, but still capable of being caught by a sharp sense of hearing. The next thing it did was let out a shrill, haunting call to the others, not too dissimilar to the sound of an elk or a deer. After hearing this call, the others stopped what they were doing and skedaddled into the fog, not bothering to look back. It became clear that whatever predator the sentries were looking out for wasn't too far away, and I had no intention of sticking around to find out what it was. Nervously, I followed after the tracks of the herd through the fog, hoping that wherever they were heading would be someplace safe. The path began to steepen as the tracks were headed to higher ground, making it more exhausting for me to follow. I had to stop to catch my breath for a few seconds before I could walk any further, the ascent to higher ground draining me of my energy. When I could finally move again, I continued to follow the trail. But when I did, the tracks up ahead hinted at something having happened. After about another few minutes of following, I noticed a forking split in what was otherwise a winding path, with individuals moving in unison, which indicated that some of the animals ran off in different directions. But something like this doesn't just happen. Something must have made them split up. Perhaps whatever predator they were potentially running from. I looked down at the tracks for any possible hints, and I found something that I didn't expect. On one of the offshoots of the tracks, besides the hooved prints, there was a different kind accompanying them. However, it wasn't something I expected at all. These tracks were smaller and longer than the hooved ones. They contain 5 digits on each toe. These characteristics are usually associated with primates. But the weirdest thing of all was that whatever this thing was, only hind limb prints were visible, and that it was walking or running on 2 legs. I honestly had no idea what the hell this thing could, nor what it was capable of. I just wanted to get the hell out of here. Another offshoot of tracks led into a rock labyrinth of eroded formations. I hadn't a clue of what potential hazards waited me inside, but I didn't want to stay out here, so I took my chances and headed in. Once inside, there was no sign of any of the animals that ran off through here, and aside from the sound of the wind, it was unsettlingly quiet. While not as thick, the fog still blocked my view of the sky above. It was somewhat reassuring, though, to see more than just a few feet in front of me. Walking through the labyrinth, the path inside seemed to twist and turn, but was still reasonably navigable. Before long, I had come across several arched and polished rocks, these likely having taken several million years to have been formed. This seemed like the safest place to be right now, with better visibility, protection from the elements, and most importantly, no potential or recognizable hazards. Or so I thought. Several white objects nestled between the rocks caught my eye. These could have just been anything, but curious as I was, I went over to get a better look, and Christ, I wish that I hadn't. I picked up one covered in soil and debris, and when I did, it was a human skull. I let out a gasp and dropped it. There were people here before, that never left. Not only, but the skull I held, it looked to be bashed in. However these people met their end, it wasn't pleasant. I wanted to puke, and I was damn well close to it, just barely holding it in. I got up and anxiously ran through the corridor, hoping to make it back outside. Then I stopped, dead in my tracks. The sound of a deep, raspy bellow echoed off the walls of the labyrinth. It was like something was being torn to shreds. Out of pure survival instinct, I dropped down and crawled across the floor of the labyrinth like a soldier crawling through the grass. I still remember the exact way it sounded, like some demonic beast ripping flesh, bit from bit, while gorging itself. What it turned out to be wasn't too far off from that. I slowly peered my head over a rocky slope and there it was. What I was looking at was some sort of reptilian creature. It had thick, reinforced scales running along its back, down to its tail like a crocodile or caiman, its jaws sporting jagged blade-like teeth as it dug into the carcass of one of the creatures I had seen earlier. The thing wasted no time mangling the corpse of its prey, holding it down with a long, dog-like forelimb, something no modern reptile I know about has. I've seen plenty of crocodilians in my field of work, but this thing, it looked like something out of the Mesozoic. Its head shot upward, out of the carcass it was feeding on, letting out a hiss, and began sniffing the air around it. Oh shit. Did this thing pick up my scent? I then noticed something. My hand. It was bleeding. I must have pricked it on the skull after dropping it earlier. But now that thing caught wind of it, and it's looking for me. Knowing I had to get the hell out of there, I quickly but quietly fled, making sure to cushion my footsteps as much as I could, so as to not give away my position. I looked behind me to make sure it wasn't following. When I did, it hit me like a truck on the highway, causing me to black out. I don't know when I regained consciousness, but when I did, I could hardly move any part of my body. I was completely numb from the neck down, just barely capable of a head tilt. I was laying out on a flat surface of sandstone, a wind-carved skylight through the rocks. Somehow I ended up here, beneath a seemingly altar-looking structure, barely capable of moving whatsoever. There's not a damn chance this was all a coincidence. That wasn't all. You know that tingle you get when you're alone, but can feel the foreboding presence of someone within your vicinity? It was sending shockwaves through the nerves of my entire body. No, this wasn't that usual sort of feeling. There were several presences here, surrounding me. One by one I saw them. They began emerging from the shadows, and their appearance, I didn't know what to make of it. These things were some sort of hominin, only they weren't. They were about 1 meter or so tall, had tails, and their face was some sort of unholy combination of human and some kind of ape, and their yellow eyes amplified an eldritch appearance. The one in the center of my field of view bore some sort of blood-red markings on its face, looking like it had just killed something. It approached me, in its prehensile tail a tree branch, and then it stopped. The ape man inhaled, raised its arms, and drove the branch into the rocky floor with its tail. Doing so riled up all the other apes, causing them to howl, screech, and pound their fists into the ground. These sounds, they were like chimpanzees, but deeper and more hoarse. I didn't know what the flying fuck was about to happen, but whatever it wasn't going to be pleasant. Another one approached, and handed an object I couldn't quite make out to the blood-faced one, presumably some sort of alpha, who proceeded to approach me, looming right over my motionless body. The alpha grasped the object, the root of some kind of plant, and slid its hand down the base. With a clenched fist held over my head, it poured some kind of red dust all over me. I remember the stuff smelling horrific. The branch in the alpha's was once more driven into the ground, signaling another one, this time covered in gashes and scars, to come forth. In its hands was a jagged stone, covered in red markings, what appeared to be dried blood. It all made sense now. Those skulls, the one I found bashed in, this was their fate, and now I was next. Not like this. Please, fuck, not like this, I muttered to myself. Then, just faintly, I felt movement in my arms. Whatever happened to render me motionless was beginning to wear off. I was still too numb to properly get up and run, though, and I was a mere seconds away from being brutally slaughtered. I tried to force as much energy as I could into motion, but the most I could make were a few inches from dragging myself. The alpha swung its branch onto my arm, causing me to let out a painful scream. The crowd continued howling and screeching, wanting to get on with it. And without any further delay, the scarred one stood above me and slowly began lifting the rock. As it ascended, all I could think of is how that was it. This is how I die, and nobody will ever know. I closed my eyes, but I didn't feel anything. Rather, I heard something. The sound of a raspy growl accompanied by the panicked and frightened hollers of the ape-men. I opened my eyes and had just enough energy to look up. And there, ripping apart a screaming ape, was the crocodilian beast from before. I knew it. The thing tracked scent of blood, my blood, to the spot. The scarred ape screeched at the reptile, catching its attention. It ran toward it, the jagged rock still in its hands. With a simple lunge forward, the croc snatched the primate in its jaws and proceeded to give it a gruesome end. I remember the deep, yet terrified screech echoing throughout the caverns. While the beast was enjoying a buffet, I regained all movement in my body and proceeded to make a break for it. The alpha jumped in front of me, letting out a furious, blood-curdling scream. It swung its branch at me, the force of which I dodged by just a few inches. Harnessing all of my energy, I kicked it, throwing it to the side and bolting into the caverns. I didn't look back as I ran, but I could hear the muffled screams and shrieks from the carnage. I wanted to look back, just to make sure none of them followed. But I knew better. I just had to get away and get out. Then, at a turn in the cavern, I saw a faint light peering through. I picked up speed, desperate to return to open ground. The only thing on my mind now was not dying. When I finally escaped outside, the fog, it was gone. This could have simply meant that it had finally passed, but that wasn't all. The time of day looked to be just about the same as well. That can't be right. I was in that fog for several hours. What stood out most, however, is that when I turned around, the entrance to the caverns I exited from was gone. All that stood there was the rounded face of a boulder. What the fuck were the only words I could conjure up. Before I could say anything else, a familiar voice rang out from behind me. "Hey, you good?" When I turned around, it was my colleague Andrea. "What's going on? You were out there a bit longer than expected. Had us worried." I was gone for a far damn longer time than just a bit longer than expected. But not wanting to sound like a lunatic, I made up an excuse. Got a bit lost. I'm fine though. Andrea went with it, and without further questions, we went back to base to pack up and fly out. It's been almost a year since all of this happened. I've kept it to myself until now. Thinking back to it all, recalling the events. Just how was any of that possible? An entire ecosystem that just materializes out of nowhere, coming and going in on random intervals. What's more, all those early accounts and writings. Could they have been more than just wild fiction? Was there some grain of truth to them? My encounter, then, is not exactly a memory I cherish, having nearly met my end. At the same time, though, I have been meaning to return. I don't know, but part of me simply wants the answers to the questions raised back then. To know how all of this was hidden from science for so long. Such is my fascination with the unknown.